My name is Elena Marsh. I'm 32. And the last Thanksgiving I spent with my family, my mother pointed at the front door in the middle of dinner and told me to leave. Not quietly, not privately, in front of 11 people, with the turkey still on the table and my nephew's paper pilgrim decorations taped to the wall behind her head. I picked up my coat. I said goodbye to my grandmother. And I walked out into the November cold and sat in my car in the driveway for 4 minutes, because that is how long it took for my grandmother to follow me out. She was 79 years old. She had her coat half buttoned and her reading glasses still on top of her head, and she was moving faster than I had seen her move in years. She got in the passenger seat, closed the door, and said, "I need to tell you something I should have told you 10 years ago. And I need to tell you tonight before that woman talks me out of it again." What she told me in that car changed every story my family had ever told about itself. And what I did with it 3 months later is why I'm sitting here now, and why my mother has not spoken to me since, and why I have stopped waiting for her to. I grew up in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, in a house that looked like every other house on the street and felt, from the inside, like a place where the air pressure was always slightly different from what you'd expected. My parents, Warren and Diane Marsh, had two children, my brother Scott, 4 years older than me, and me. Scott was the kind of older brother who got his photo on the mantle first and never had to move over to make room. Athletic, easy, quick with a laugh. He walked through rooms the way my parents' friends described him, natural. I was described differently. Sensitive. Intense. A little much sometimes. These were the words that circled me the way weather circles a building, not quite touching, never quite leaving. I want to be careful here because my childhood was not a terrible one. My parents fed me and housed me and showed up for the things parents show up for. But there is a kind of love that is conditional in ways that are never stated and therefore can never be negotiated. And I had grown up inside that kind of love without having the language for it until I was well into my 20s, and a therapist named Andrea gave me the vocabulary, and I sat in her office and felt the floor tilt very slightly beneath me. My grandmother, my father's mother, a woman named Rose Marsh, who had been widowed young and raised my father alone on a teacher's salary in eastern Ohio, was the exception. She had always been the exception. She called on birthdays before anyone else and remembered details that parents forget. The name of my college roommate, the project I'd been stressed about in March, the book I'd mentioned in passing 6 months earlier. She paid attention the way people pay attention when they have decided a person matters. I had always known this about her and had never once taken it for granted. I should tell you what I did for work because it matters for what came later. I was a family law paralegal at a firm in Columbus. Not a lawyer. I'd done my certification at night while working days and built my way up to a senior paralegal position over 7 years. I spent my days inside the machinery of family legal disputes, divorces, custody arrangements, estate contests, the formal documents that describe what a family is when the performance has stopped and the law needs the truth. I was good at reading the gap between what people said and what the documents showed. That gap is almost always where the actual story lives. My personal life had its own gap that I'd been avoiding for years. I had a long-term relationship that ended when I was 28, an apartment I loved in Clintonville, a close friend named Priya who asked me exactly the right questions and let me be wrong about things until I figured them out myself. I was, by most measures, fine. I came home for holidays because that is what you do when you are fine and your family is 2 hours away, and not monstrous, just difficult. And every Thanksgiving, I drove to the house on Sycamore Lane and sat at the table that had my grandfather's old chair at the head of it and ate my mother's green bean casserole and managed the specific tension of being in a room where I was loved in the way a piece of furniture is loved, acknowledged, useful, not quite seen. The Thanksgiving I'm telling you about was 3 years ago. The guest list that year was larger than usual. My parents, Scott and his wife Karen, their two kids aged 7 and 4, my Aunt Patricia, my father's sister, and her husband, my grandmother Rose, two of my mother's sisters with their husbands, and me. 11 people plus me at a table in a dining room built for 8. My mother had been in a particular mood since I'd arrived, a mood I recognized, the specific tightness of a woman who has organized a large event and needs it to go a specific way and is already monitoring it for deviations before it has started. I had brought wine and a pie and had offered twice to help and been redirected both times to the living room where the children were watching a movie. I sat with my niece and nephew for 40 minutes watching animated turkeys and thought about the gap between the holiday my family performed and the holiday my family had. The dinner itself was fine for the first 40 minutes. Then my mother's sister, Patricia, said something about a property in eastern Ohio. A piece of land she'd heard was being dealt with, something connected to my grandmother's estate planning. She said it casually, the way people say things they've been waiting to say casually. My grandmother, who had been quiet through most of dinner, went very still. My mother's face did something I caught from across the table, a quick flash of something that was not quite alarm and not quite anger. Then my mother looked at me, not at Patricia. At me. Elena, she said. Her voice was precise in the way it gets when she has decided something. I think it would be better if you headed home tonight. The table went quiet. My nephew looked up from his plate. Scott didn't move. My father looked at his hands. I'm sorry? I said. You've seemed uncomfortable all evening. I think it would be better for everyone if you headed out. Uncomfortable. I had been sitting in the living room with the children for 40 minutes watching turkey cartoons. But I understood, with the particular clarity that comes from a lifetime of reading the gap between what someone says and what the document shows, that this was not about my comfort. This was about the property Patricia had just mentioned. This was about whatever my grandmother had gone still about. This was about something in this room that my mother had decided I was not supposed to hear. I picked up my napkin. I set it on the table. I looked at my grandmother, who was looking back at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not grief, not guilt, something closer to decision. A woman making up her mind in real time about something she had been weighing for a long time. Good night, I said to the table. I hugged my niece and nephew. I said goodbye to the aunts, who were carefully looking at their plates. I got my coat from the closet. I did not say goodbye to my mother. I walked out the front door into the November dark and got into my car and started the engine and sat there with the heat running, looking at the lit windows of the house and waited for I did not know what. 4 minutes. That is how long it took. The front door opened and my grandmother came down the porch steps in her good coat, half buttoned, reading glasses on her head, moving with the focused speed of a woman who has made a decision and does not want to lose her nerve before she executes it. She pulled open the passenger door and got in and closed it with both hands and sat for a moment getting her breath back. Then she said, I need to tell you something I should have told you 10 years ago. And I need to tell you tonight before that woman talks me out of it again. I turned down the heat. Okay, I said. She looked at her hands in her lap. The reading glasses on top of her head caught the light from the porch. You know I have a piece of property in Coshocton County, she said. The 40 acres where your grandfather and I lived before we moved to Columbus. I knew the property by memory. I'd visited it as a child. A farmhouse and a wood-framed barn and 40 acres of mixed field and tree line on the edge of a small watershed. My grandmother had kept it after my grandfather died, renting the farmhouse to a couple who maintained it in exchange for the rent. Your grandfather left it to me when he died, she said. We talked about what would happen to it eventually. He wanted it to stay in the family, and I did too. We talked about leaving it to your father and Patricia equally. She paused. Then your father got married. I did not say anything. Your mother is a capable woman, Rose said. Capable in her voice was not a compliment. It was a description of function. She has managed your father for 30 years, and she has managed this family for 30 years, and she is very good at it. When your grandfather died, she began managing the conversation about the property. Slowly at first, but very consistently. She looked at the house. About 10 years ago, your father came to me and told me your mother had suggested the property should go to Scott. That Scott was the one who had children, who might actually use the land, who understood what the property meant to the family. I said, and Patricia? Your Aunt Patricia was told the same story at the same time. That I had decided to leave the property to Scott. She was not happy, but she accepted it because she believed I had decided. I turned to look at my grandmother. But you hadn't decided. I hadn't decided anything, she said. I hadn't been asked. I was presented with a decision that had apparently already been made and told it was mine. She turned to face me. Her eyes in the dark of the car were very clear. But it wasn't only about Scott. She also suggested, your mother, that if the property was going to Scott, your grandfather's tools and the contents of the barn should go to Scott as well, and the farmhouse furniture. I agreed to that too, because she presented it as the logical extension, and I was 80 and I was tired, and I trusted your father to know what his wife was recommending. She was quiet for a moment. 3 months ago, I asked your father to bring me the documentation. The trust amendment? I wanted to read it myself. He kept saying he'd bring it and not bringing it. Last month, I called your father's attorney directly and asked for a copy. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and pulled out a folded document. The amendment names Scott as the beneficiary of the property, the barn contents, and the farmhouse furnishings. It also includes a provision I did not know about. She unfolded it and held it toward me. A right of first refusal clause. If the property is ever sold, Scott, or your mother, as his designated agent, has the right to be notified before any sale and to match any offer. I looked at the document. I am a family law paralegal. I read those documents every day. I understood immediately what a right of first refusal clause in the hands of a designated agent meant in practical terms. It meant control, not just over who received the property, but over what happened to it afterward, indefinitely. It meant my mother had not just redirected a piece of land. She had built a mechanism to manage it in perpetuity, under Scott's name, with herself as the operating authority. Did you sign this? I asked. I signed an amendment, my grandmother said. I signed what your father told me was the documentation of my decision. I did not read it carefully because I trusted him to present it accurately. She looked at the document in my hands. I am telling you this tonight because when Patricia mentioned the property at dinner, your mother looked at you, not at Patricia. You, and I understood that she was afraid of what you know. What you do, and I decided that whatever she's afraid of you knowing, you should know it. I sat in the car with the document in my hands and the heat running and the lit windows of my parents' house in front of me, and I thought about 10 years. About every Thanksgiving, every holiday, every dinner where the air pressure was slightly off and I couldn't name why. About the gap between what people said and what the documents showed. Rose, I said, I need you to let me help you. She looked at me for a long moment. I was hoping you'd say that, she said. I want to stop here. Because I know what some of you are thinking. You're wondering why my grandmother waited. Why she signed documents she hadn't read carefully. Why a woman this sharp, this present, this deliberate, had allowed this to go on for 10 years. And I want to tell you what she told me when I asked her that later, not in the car, but in my apartment in Columbus 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, sitting at my kitchen table with tea and the full set of documents spread between us. She said, when you are 80 years old and your son is the person you trust most in the world, and his wife brings him to you and presents you with a decision and tells you it is yours, you believe it. Not because you are foolish. Because you have spent 50 years building a family on trust and you are not ready, at 80, to discover that the trust was one-directional. She set down her tea. I am not a foolish woman, but I am a woman who loved her son. And love makes you want to believe the version of the story where the people you love are not doing the thing you're starting to think they might be doing. I have thought about that sentence more than almost any other sentence in my adult life. Love makes you want to believe the version of the story where the people you love are not doing the thing you're starting to think they might be doing. That is the mechanism. That is how it works every time. Not cruelty, not stupidity. Love, turned in the wrong direction by people who understood how to use it. Subscribe if you haven't, because the next part is where I sit down with the documents, and what I found in them changed everything. I spent the week after Thanksgiving reading, not the amendment my grandmother had handed me in the car. I'd read that in 20 minutes and understood its structure immediately. I spent the week reading the full history of the property trust, which my grandmother requested from the attorney, and which arrived in a packet that I spread across my kitchen table on a Saturday morning and did not leave until late that night. The property had been placed in trust in 2003 after my grandfather's death. The original trust document was clean and standard. Rose as trustee, the property held for her lifetime use, with equal distribution to Warren and Patricia at her death. That was the document my grandfather had been told about. The document he'd agreed to. Then the amendments started. The first, from 2009, modified the equal split to give Warren a larger share, on the stated grounds that Warren had been more involved in maintaining the property. Patricia had signed a consent to this modification. I read the consent carefully. It was 1 page. It did not include the full text of the amendment. It referenced it by number, which meant Patricia had consented to something she had been given a summary of, not the actual text. The second amendment, from 2014, was the one my grandmother had signed, the one removing Patricia entirely and naming Scott as sole beneficiary, with the right of first refusal clause. My grandmother had signed it. There was a witness signature and a notary stamp. The notary was an employee of my father's company. I stared at that line for a long time. A notary who worked for the person whose wife had drafted the arrangement. I went back through the 2009 amendment. Same notary. I pulled up the Ohio notary regulations on my laptop. A notary cannot notarize a document when they have a direct financial interest in the outcome, or when the signatory is in a dependent relationship with the notary's employer. An employee notarizing a document that benefits the employer, that is a problem. Not an automatic invalidation, but a problem that a competent attorney could use. I called my supervising attorney at the firm, a woman named Catherine, on Monday morning and asked her to walk me through it as a hypothetical. She did. Then she said, "Elena, is this a personal matter?" I said yes. She said, "Do you want a referral?" I said yes. The attorney Catherine referred me to was named Martin Osei. He was a trusts and estates specialist with 30 years of experience and the specific quality of very good attorneys. He asked questions until the shape of the thing was clear and then told you exactly what it was. I brought him the full packet in January, 2 months after Thanksgiving. He read it at his desk while I sat across from him. He asked 4 questions. Then he said, "The notary issue creates a challenge pathway. The 2009 consent is also problematic. Partial disclosure is not full informed consent under Ohio law, and if we can show Patricia received only a summary, the modification to the split may not hold." What about the 2014 amendment? The right of first refusal clause naming a third party as designated agent, that is non-standard. In a family trust, that kind of clause typically names the trustee or a successor trustee, not a spouse. It would need to be reviewed carefully. He set down the papers. "Who is the third party named as designated agent?" "My mother," I said. He nodded slowly. "What does your grandmother want?" "She wants the original distribution honored," I said. "The one she and my grandfather agreed to. Warren and Patricia equally. She does not want the property to go to Scott or to my mother's management." "And your grandmother is competent?" "She can testify to her intent. She is 79, fully competent and very clear about what she wants and what she did not agree to." Martin looked at the packet one more time. Then he said, "This is a viable challenge. It will take time and it will be uncomfortable. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the car in the driveway. Rose with her coat half-buttoned, moving faster than I had seen her move in years. "I need to tell you tonight before that woman talks me out of it again." "My grandmother is prepared," I said. "I'm prepared." "Then let's begin." I told my grandmother before I told anyone else. She came to Columbus for a weekend in January, and I showed her everything Martin had explained, and she sat at my kitchen table and read through it with the careful attention of a woman who wished she had read things this carefully 10 years ago. When she was done, she said, "Can it be fixed?" "Martin believes the original distribution can be restored," I said. "It will require Patricia's cooperation on the 2009 challenge and your testimony on the 2014 amendment." "Patricia will cooperate," she said, with the certainty of someone who had watched Patricia sit at a Thanksgiving table and hold her tongue for 10 years. "She's been waiting for permission." "And Dad?" I asked. My grandmother was quiet for a moment. She looked at her tea. "Your father is a good man who has made a long series of small choices in the direction of his wife's preferences," she said. "He will be angry. He will feel accused of something he will tell himself he didn't do. And eventually, I believe eventually, he will understand what actually happened, and it will cost him something. And that cost is his to pay, not yours to prevent." I sat with that. "And my mother?" "Your mother will fight it," she said simply. "She is a capable woman. But she is not a lawyer, and she is not you, and she is not me. And she built this on the assumption that I would never understand what she'd done, and you would never look. She was wrong on both counts." She looked at me across the table. "You are the reason I got in that car," she said. "I knew you'd know what to do. I've always known that about you. I thought about every holiday, every Thanksgiving, every dinner where the air pressure was slightly off and I felt it and couldn't name it. I had always known something was wrong. I had never had the document in hand." "She was afraid of what you know," Rose had said in the car. My mother had looked at me when Patricia mentioned the property. Not at Patricia. At me. She had known on some level that I was the variable she hadn't fully accounted for. She had sent me out into the November cold because the alternative was letting me stay in the room. That was the last mistake she made. The challenge was filed in March. Martin and his colleagues built the case on three pillars: the notary issue in both amendments, the partial disclosure to Patricia in 2009, and my grandmother's direct testimony that the 2014 amendment had been presented as the documentation of a decision she had not actually made. My grandmother testified. She was 79 years old, and she sat in a formal proceeding and described, in her precise and unhurried way, exactly what had happened, and exactly what she had agreed to, and exactly what she had not. My father hired an attorney. He and my mother contested the challenge. It took 5 months. It was, as Martin had promised, uncomfortable. My mother called me once during that period, a Sunday evening, and the call lasted 4 minutes. She told me I was destroying our family over money and that I would regret it. I said I was restoring what my grandfather had intended over a document my grandmother had not fully consented to, and that I did not regret it. She said what my grandmother had told the attorney was not accurate. I said my grandmother was competent and clear and had testified under oath, and I believed her. She hung up. My father did not call. Patricia called once a week. She was, as Rose had predicted, waiting for permission to say what she had apparently wanted to say for 10 years, and once the proceeding gave her the formal context to say it, she said it thoroughly and specifically and without hesitation. The trust was restructured in August. The original equal split between Warren and Patricia was restored. The right of first refusal clause was struck. Scott's designation was removed. My mother's role as designated agent was eliminated. It was clean documentation of the original intent, the thing my grandfather had agreed to and my grandmother had always meant. My mother has not spoken to me since the proceeding concluded. My father called me 3 weeks after the judgment, from a number I didn't recognize. He'd called from his office, not his cell, which meant something about the geography of that call he'd needed to think about. He said he wanted me to know he understood I had been trying to help my grandmother and not to hurt him. I said that was true and that I was sorry it had hurt him anyway. He said some things that were true and some that were not fully true, and I let him say all of them because he was my father and he had been in a difficult position for 10 years, and that is not nothing. He did not apologize for what had happened. I did not ask him to. Some apologies require a person to see themselves a certain way, and my father was not ready to see himself that way yet. And I had learned, from Andrea, from 7 years of family law, from my grandmother in a dark car in a driveway in November, that you cannot make that kind of seeing happen. You can only keep the door open and let the person find their way through it if they choose. The door is open. My father knows it is open. That is what I can do, and it is what I have done. Scott called once. He was confused and defensive in the way of someone who has received something and told himself it was earned. I told him I didn't blame him and I meant it. He hadn't built the mechanism. He had just been placed inside it. That is a different thing, and I tried not to conflate the two. He didn't call again, and I didn't call either, but I left that door open too. My grandmother came to Columbus for Thanksgiving this year. Not to the house on Sycamore Lane, to my apartment. It was just the two of us and Priya, who brought wine and a sweet potato dish and stayed until 11 talking about everything and nothing. My grandmother sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and her reading glasses on top of her head and looked at my apartment. The bookshelves, the plants I have been attempting to keep alive with mixed results. The print above the sofa that I bought at a gallery 3 years ago because it made me feel something I couldn't name and still can't. And she said, "This is a good place." I thought about the house on Sycamore Lane, the paper pilgrim decorations, the air pressure that was always slightly off. "Yes," I said. "It is." She turned her wineglass in her hands. "I should have told you 10 years ago." "You told me when you could," I said. "In the car." "In November." "I was afraid," she said. "Not of your mother. I want to be clear about that. I was afraid of what it would cost your father to find out his wife had done what his wife had done. I kept thinking, if I just wait a little longer, maybe it won't have to be this hard for him." She looked at the table. "I protected him instead of you, and that was wrong." I had thought about this a great deal, about what it costs to protect people from their own difficult truths, about how that protection always lands on someone, and it is almost never the person doing the protecting. "It's done now," I said. "The property is right." "It is," she said. "But I want you to know what I did in that car that night. I should have done it 10 years ago." I looked at her across the table. 79 years old, reading glasses on her head, still moving fast when it matters, still finding the available path when the direct one is blocked. "Rose," I said, You got in the car. Her eyes went a little bright. I got in the car, she said. Yes. That's enough, I said. That is more than enough. Here's what I want to leave you with. The house on Sycamore Lane is still there. My parents still live in it. The paper pilgrim decorations presumably come out every November and go back into the bin in December. The green bean casserole is probably still made from the same recipe, and the table is probably still built for 8 and seating 11. None of that has changed. What has changed is that I am no longer at that table pretending the air pressure is normal. What has changed is that my grandmother sat in my car in November and told me the truth, and I drove to Columbus and read the documents and made the calls and let the law do what the law is built for. Create a record. Establish what is true. Describe a thing accurately so that it cannot be denied. I spent 7 years as a family law paralegal watching families tear each other apart over money. I used to think that was what it was about. The money. I understand now that it is almost never about the money. It is about the story. Who gets to tell it? Who gets to be in it? Who gets to be seen? My mother spent 10 years managing the story of that property and of this family and of who each person in it was and what they deserved. She managed it carefully and quietly, and she was very good at it. What she did not account for was a grandmother with a coat half-buttoned and reading glasses on her head who got tired of the managed story and decided the truth was more important than the peace, and a granddaughter who had spent 7 years learning how to read the gap between what people say and what the documents show. We were the two variables she had not fully calculated. We were enough. If you are in a family where the story is being managed and you are not the one managing it, you are not crazy. The air pressure is different. You are right that it is different. The document exists. Somewhere in the history of your family there is a record of what was decided and how and by whom, and you have every right to read it. You have every right to sit in a car in November and let the person you trust tell you what they know. You have every right to go home and spread the papers on the table and call the person who can help you understand them. The capable one. The one who can handle it. The one who doesn't need as much. You need this. You are allowed to need it. And the truth, once it is on paper and witnessed and filed, does not need you to be loud or dramatic or angry. It only needs you to show up. Thank you for being here all the way to the end. Drop a comment. Tell me, has someone in your life ever gotten in the car for you? I want to know. Subscribe if you haven't. And I'll see you in the next one. I should tell you about the 10 days between Thanksgiving and my first call to Catherine, because that is where most of the internal work happened. The slow work, the kind that doesn't make the story move forward, but is the reason the story moves forward at all. I drove home from Sycamore Lane that night with my grandmother's document on the passenger seat and my hands steady on the wheel and the November highway dark and empty ahead of me. I did not play music. I did not call Priya, though I thought about it. I needed the 2 hours of silence before I did anything else because I understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has sat across from enough families in enough conference rooms to know what she was looking at, that I was about to do something that could not be undone. Not legally. Not in terms of the challenge. That was just a filing, just paperwork, just the formal language my job had taught me. What could not be undone was the act of seeing. Once you have seen something clearly, you cannot unsee it. Once you have held the document and read the clause and understood what it means, you cannot go back to the version of the story where you didn't know. I had spent 32 years in a family where the story was managed. I had sat at that table for 32 Thanksgivings and felt the air pressure and gone home, and told myself it was just the way some families are. I had been, in every way that mattered, the easy daughter, the one who didn't cause problems, the one who absorbed the dinner without making anyone uncomfortable. That version of me had walked out the front door into November, cold 32 times, and gotten in her car and driven home, and never once sat in the driveway long enough for the truth to come and find her in the passenger seat. This time I had. This time I stayed. And sitting in the car in the driveway for 4 minutes while my grandmother got her coat and her nerve together was the most important thing I had done in 32 years of Thanksgivings, and I had done it by doing nothing except not driving away. Sometimes the whole thing turns on just that. Not leaving when you could leave. Not driving away when the driveway gives you every reason to. Staying in the car with the heat on and the windows fogging and trusting that if there is something to be found, it will find you. I want to tell you about Patricia because she is a part of this story that I have not given enough space to. Patricia Marsh, my father's sister, The woman who had mentioned the property at Thanksgiving and caused my mother to look at me, the woman who had signed a consent she hadn't fully read in 2009 and had been living with the consequences of that signature for 14 years, was not what I'd expected when I called her in December. I had always known Patricia as the family's quiet dissenter, the one who said the slightly too honest thing at Christmas and then backed down when my mother's expression changed. The one who had, as long as I could remember, a particular quality of controlled frustration in every family gathering, the quality of someone who knows something they have decided not to say. I had attributed this to her personality. It was not her personality. It was the specific frustration of a woman who had been removed from her own father's legacy through a document she had been told was a formality, and who had spent 14 years knowing something was wrong and not having the tools to name it. When I called her in December, she answered on the first ring. I told her what I had, what my grandmother had told me, what the document showed. She was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then she said, "I've been waiting for this call for 14 years." She said it without drama, just fact. The flat fact of a woman whose patience had finally been answered. We talked for 90 minutes. She told me things about the years since 2009 that I had not known. The small moments of exclusion, the decisions made without her, the way my mother had positioned herself as the family's practical center and redistributed everything outward from that center in directions that benefited her and Scott. Patricia had watched it and absorbed it and told herself that fighting it wasn't worth the cost to the family. "I have a brother I love," she said. "I kept thinking, if I push on this, I lose him. And I kept not pushing." She paused. "But I lost the property anyway. And watching you get sent out of a Thanksgiving dinner made me realize it was never going to be enough. However much I gave ground, it was never going to be enough. I understood that. I had spent 32 years being the easy daughter, and it had not earned me a seat at the table. It had just made the removal quieter. "Are you willing to cooperate with the challenge?" I asked. "Yes," she said. No hesitation. "Whatever I need to do." She was, as Rose had said, waiting for permission. I had given it, and what she did with it, the testimony she gave, the documentation she provided, the clarity and steadiness with which she described 14 years of watching something be built that had been built at her expense, was some of the most important work in the whole case. Martin told me afterward that Patricia's testimony was the part that made the 2009 modification impossible to defend. She had signed a consent form. She had not been given the full text of what she consented to. She had asked for clarification at the time and been told it was standard language and not to worry. That is not consent. That is management. And the law, given the chance, knows the difference. There was a moment in August, the week before the judgment came through, when I drove out to Coshocton County alone. I had never been to the property as an adult. I had visited as a child. I had some blurry memory of the barn, a tire swing, my grandfather's voice, but I had not been back. I drove east from Columbus on a Tuesday morning in August, with the windows down and the radio off, and turned onto the county road that the address corresponded to, and drove until I saw the farmhouse. It was smaller than I remembered. White clapboard, a porch across the front, a barn set back from the house with the door slightly open. The fields were overgrown in the way fields go when they haven't been actively farmed in years. Tall grass and wildflowers, and the beginning of young trees pushing up along the fence line where the meadow met the wood. The couple who had rented the house was still there. A man came to the porch when I pulled in, and I introduced myself as Helen's granddaughter and explained that the estate was in process. He nodded. He had kind eyes and a measured manner. He had lived on this property for 19 years. He said, "Your grandmother used to come out once a year. Every October. She'd walk the fence line and come back and have coffee on the porch. She never said much. She just wanted to see it." I stood in the driveway and looked at the farmhouse and the barn and the fields going wild and the wood line in the distance, and thought about a woman who drove out every October to walk the fence line and see that the land was still there, who had planted her intention in 2003 and spent 20 years trying to make sure it held, who had sat in a car in November at 79 with her coat half-buttoned and her reading glasses on top of her head, and decided that the time for managed silence was over. I stood there for a while, long enough for the morning to get warm and the grass to smell like August, and the birds in the fence line to stop noticing me and go back to their business. Then I got in the car and drove back to Columbus. The property was not yet mine to stand on as anything other than a visitor. but I had been there. I had seen it. I understood what she had been trying to preserve and why it mattered and what it meant that someone had tried to redirect it. The judgment came through the following Tuesday. The property was restored to the original distribution. Patricia called me when she heard and cried in a way I had not heard her cry before. Not the controlled, careful tears of someone managing a family gathering, but the actual release of a woman who had been holding something for 14 years and had finally been allowed to set it down. I did not cry that day. I had done most of my crying in the car on the drive to Coshocton County, in the particular privacy of a Tuesday morning on a county road with the windows down and nobody watching and the August fields going past on both sides. Sometimes you save the feeling for when you can afford to have it. That was when I could afford it, and I had. Rose called me the morning after the judgment. She had heard from Martin's office the evening before, but she wanted to call me herself. She asked how I was doing, and I said I was good, which was true. She said, "The property is right now." I said, "The property is right." She was quiet for a moment, in the way she gets quiet when she is about to say something she has been weighing. "I've been thinking about what your grandfather would say," she said. "He was not a complicated man. He built things, and he maintained them, and he wanted them to last. He would have been upset by what happened. But I think what would have upset him most was not the documents. It was the idea that someone in the family was looking at you and deciding you didn't count as much." I didn't say anything. "He liked you," she said, "from when you were very small. He used to say you were the one who paid attention, that you noticed things. He thought that was a gift." I thought about my grandfather. He had died when I was 12. Too early for me to know him as an adult, too present in my early years for me to feel his absence cleanly. He was a shape in the family story I had never fully been able to see. "He was right," Rose said, "about the gift. You noticed. And you did something with it." I held the phone and looked out my window at the Columbus morning coming in through the glass. "Rose," I said, "why did you keep coming back to Thanksgiving?" "Every year. All those years where you knew what had been done and you came anyway and you sat at that table." She was quiet for a moment. "Because you were there," she said. "Every year you were there." And I told myself, as long as I come, she knows someone is watching. Someone is in the room who sees her. I had not known this. I had felt it, the particular quality of her presence, the specific attention. But I had not known that was what it was. She had been coming for me. Every year, coat and reading glasses and the long drive from eastern Ohio, she had been coming to sit at a table in a house where someone was managing the story, to be the one person in the room who saw me clearly and let me know, without words, that the seeing was happening. "You were there." And I told myself, as long as I come, she knows someone is watching. I have no better description of love than that. No more complete definition. Someone watching. Someone staying in the room. Someone getting in the car. Thank you for listening to all of this. It means more than I can say. Drop a comment. Tell me who has stayed in the room for you. Who got in the car. I will read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't. And I'll see you next time.